The thing about the Highlander franchise is that they forgot the one golden rule that Connor Macleod kept repeating.
There can be only one.
If they'd stuck to the lore they had laid down in the first film, that the immortals all fight till the time of the gathering, when only one of them will remain to get the gift, along with all the memories, skills, and knowledge of the rest of the immortals, they would have still been a highly talked about franchise. But no, they had to make Macleod an alien in the sequel, and in the third film, they refused whatever happened in the second film, and brought back more immortals. It's annoying. Thankfully, fans of the original film can enjoy this limited issue comic book series called Highlander: Way of the Sword. The comic book does not subvert the lore and fits in perfectly with the first film. The Sword of a Friend. The events of the comic happened somewhere in between Ramirez's death at the hands of Kurgan and Kurgan's death at the hands of Macleod. It's the adventures the two immortals have that revolve around the legendary sword of Ramirez. I know, I should get to the story already. Our tale begins in 1804 in the Atlantic Ocean, where Macleod is aboard the HMS Victory, fighting against Napoleon Bonaparte of France with the sword of his best friend and mentor, Ramirez. Even Macleod can't believe that he is fighting under the very English crown that brought nothing but misery to Scotland, but there aren't any kinsmen left to judge him. With that, he leaps across the sea and into the French ship to take the enemies head on. As luck would have it, the Kurgan is also aboard the same ship and can't wait to behead Macleod. The two immortals start going at it with their swords when suddenly a cannon attack breaks the mast of the ship they are in and traps his fellow soldier, Lieutenant Kavanaugh, who looks like a teenager at best. Macleod sticks his sword in the Kurgan and rushes to the aid of Kavanaugh. Once he is back with Kavanaugh on their ship, Admiral Nelson congratulates him on saving Kavanaugh and asks him not to worry too much about losing his sword, as a man's worth depends on his heart and not on any piece of metal. Macleod, however, cannot stop thinking about the sword, as it meant a lot to him, and it now belonged to the man who killed Ramirez. Years later, in 1966, the sword makes an appearance in London when an old woman named Stasia sells it to Antonio Di Renzo, an underground arts dealer. Macleod's friend Ian, who knew him by the name of Russell Nash, witnesses the deal and calls him to London. From here on out, I am going to refer to Macleod as Russell Nash whenever he's interacting with people who only know him as Russell, so don't get confused. Ian's surprised to see that the years seem to have had no effect on Russell and credits the cleaner environment of the United States. He then takes him to Paris, where rumor has it that Antonio was holding an underground auction. All Ian has to go on is a photograph of Antonio. In the crowds of Paris, Macleod gets a feeling that another immortal is nearby. That's when his eyes fall on Guiran Biu, who had sensed him too. The two make plans to meet at midnight at Point Royal and continue with their business. Ian is taken aback by the conversation, but figures out that the French have always been a bit weird. For the next 6 hours, Ian and Russell walk around antique shops looking for anything that might catch their eye. They find nothing, and Ian leaves Russell to get some dinner while Russell refuses to stop. In one of the shops, Russell finds a tartan kilt that belonged to the Weir clan, an honorable family who defended the lowlands from the English. The owner of the antique shop, Elizabeth, gets his drift when he says he is looking for secret treasures hidden in the city and offers to part with the information over a meal. Elizabeth seems to know all about Russell, or at least all about the mortal persona Macleod's built, and offers an invitation to the auction, knowing Russell's penchant for being discreet. Oh, Elizabeth, if you only knew how discreet he was being. Elizabeth asks what he wants so terribly, as she doesn't find any interest in antiques, considering them just a part of her job, and Macleod shares that to him it is about connecting to the past and finding a piece of himself. Of course, only you and I know how literal that is. That night, on his way to the hotel room, Macleod ponders over Ramirez's warning not to give his heart to mortal women, and the pain he felt over losing his first wife, Heather. It was easier to control the mind than the brain, though. The pondering is brought to an abrupt halt when Macleod finds the door of his room open with Ian lying lifeless on the floor. The only logical conclusion was that Guiran had arrived early. So Macleod sets out with his sword and roams Paris till he finds Guiran on top of a building. An intense sword fight begins, and Macleod tells Guiran that he should have left him and Ian alone. They are so engrossed in their fight that they don't even realize when they jump off the building into a carriage where two honeymooners were enjoying each other's company. While the couple screamed in confusion and fear, the swords clanged and the fight refused to stop. They continue vigorously till they topple over a wall and into the church of Saint Julien le Pauvre. The two stop, as it is the rule of the immortals not to fight on holy grounds. Elizabeth greets the two and welcomes them to the auction, which is about to begin. Though he had completely forgotten about it, Macleod had found his way to the secret auction. Now that's what I call serendipity. The Kurgan at large. In 1918, Galuzzo, Italy, two women lure a monk away from his monastery on the instructions of the Kurgan. The monk is caught off guard and tries to use the rule of the holy ground, but Kurgan knows that the holy ground ended at the cobblestone path, from which they were quite far. Kurgan beheads him and absorbs his essence. That night, when Kurgan was fast asleep, the two women robbed him and left. One of these women was Stasia, who we saw sell the sword to Antonio. Now, as the auction was about to begin, Elizabeth comments how overzealous collectors were and that Russell must have been fighting Giron for honor and the right to claim the best of the artifacts. In the auction, Russell meets his immortal friend Sunda Castagir. After exchanging pleasantries, Macleod shares the reason he was there, to get back Ramirez's sword. Sunda belittles his obsession with steel, but Macleod reminds him that Ramirez was like a father to him, and he was the one who showed Macleod who he truly was. Macleod waits patiently for Ramirez's sword to show up at the auction, but it doesn't. By the end of the auction, Elizabeth tells him that Giron had asked her to remind him about a lunch appointment at Café Bijou the next day. She's also surprised that Russell did not bid for anything and asks what he was looking for. Russell describes the sword for her, a Japanese katana with a dragon head pommel and an ivory grip. Elizabeth immediately recognizes it as the Masamune and tells him that they already found a buyer for it. When she takes him to meet the buyer, he realizes that Elizabeth was Antonio's sister. He then meets Toshiro Nakayata, the buyer of the Masamune. Russell asks whether he would like to sell the sword soon, but Toshiro replies that he is a direct descendant of Masamune, who made the sword and he couldn't part with it as it was a symbol of honor and strength. Antonio promises the sword the next day, and the auction soon turns into a joyful party. Macleod was going through a dilemma of his own. He was falling in love with Elizabeth, appreciating love through her mortal eyes, and was painfully aware of the sorrow that would envelop him once she succumbed to her death. But Macleod allows himself the pleasure one last time, and the two enjoy a blissful evening together. The next morning, he leaves the sleeping Elizabeth to go battle Giron. The sword fight reaches the same intensity it had the previous night, and their fight leads them into a movie theater. As Macleod beheads Giron and absorbs his essence amid the crackling lights, the audience at the movie theater rush out, except for one loyal cinephile who is too absorbed in the film to even consider the horrors happening around him. Salute to you, man. Elsewhere, Antonio hands over the Masamune to Toshiro in a warehouse. Admiring the sword, Toshiro remembers his father's words that a sword like that could not be possessed but earned. Antonio remarks that his father must have been a smart man. Toshiro's clearly not resolved his daddy issues yet, as he calls his father a foolish man like Antonio and slits his throat. He reminds Antonio that the sword belongs to him and that he was not going to pay for something that's his. Reunited, and how? We get a glimpse of one of the earliest fights between Ramirez and the Kurgan in ancient Greece, 479 BC, at the Battle of Plataea. Ramirez knew that the Kurgan was the strongest of the immortals, and every time he fought him, he felt doomed, but his sword, the Masamune, always gave him an edge. Macleod remembers Ramirez's lesson on the importance of steel, which he imparted in Scotland 1541. Ramirez had often credited his lack of failure to the sword. These were the thoughts in Macleod's mind as he traveled beside Elizabeth to Florence in 1966. Elizabeth wanted Antonio to be buried there and was full of grief, but Russell consoled her, reminding her that all life was important and meant to be cherished. In Florence, after Antonio is buried, Elizabeth tells Russell that they had no family besides each other and had chosen Florence to be their home because they liked the city. Macleod senses the anger in her heart and hopes to get her revenge, but more than that, his intentions are fueled by his want of the sword. He heads to Japan and meets with a friend, Amika, to know more about Toshiro. According to her, Toshiro was nothing like Masamune and was a cold-hearted, impulsive, and arrogant man who carried the sword around like a trophy. That night, Macleod broke into Toshiro's mansion and knocked out his bodyguard, who was a skilled fighter in his own accord, as he had managed to land an impressive punch in his skull. Toshiro sees Macleod and tells him that he traveled quite far to die. With that, he attacks him with his sword, but Macleod has been sword fighting over centuries. He tells Toshiro that he has no honor and that he's not worthy of the Masamune. They crash into the balcony, and while Toshiro is cornered, he strikes the Masamune into Macleod's shoulder. Macleod is way smarter though, as he cuts off Toshiro's hand at the wrist, causing him to tumble down without the sword. He then pulls out the sword, a major part of his best friend's life, and smiles as he is reunited with it. When Macleod leaves, he knows the affair with Toshiro isn't over yet, and he couldn't be more accurate. Another immortal. In 593 BC, in Japan, when Ramirez was known as Takane, he fell in love with Princess Shakiko, who he believed to be his soulmate. On the day of their wedding, Ramirez received 2 gifts from her father, the great Masamune. He gave her the greatest creation of God, his daughter, to wed, and the greatest creation of man, a sword made by himself. Ramirez was shocked about the incredible quality of the sword and asked whether it was made of stone. Masamune replied that it was made of an ore found in the mountains, and it was one of its kind. Not believing his luck, Ramirez pressed to know who the sword was made for, as surely he did not have Takane in mind. Masamune revealed that he had made it for his only son, Ren, a boy he had adopted from a ravaged village in the Northlands. When Masamune had found Ren, he had believed him to be a gift from God, as he had no sons of his own, but as Ren grew up, Masamune realized that Ren was spared that day, as even the gods did not want him. He was a cruel and violent child who did not deserve the honor of the sword. Masamune had considered Ramirez to be honorable and asked him to call him father. That little boy, Ren, who had overheard their conversation, was none other than Toshiro, also an immortal. Toshiro wondered if his father would have trusted him with the sword if he knew he was an immortal, but his father's opinion did not matter now, as he was just a corpse now. In his anger, Toshiro travels to Florence in 1966, where Elizabeth and Macleod had begun to live together. Elizabeth is still surprised that he's with her, as she can see it in his eyes that he has other things to attend to. Macleod knows that he has bigger fish to fry too, but love is a strong force, and he finds it impossible to leave Elizabeth's side. He wonders if it is worth shutting his heart off to emotions, and whether it would leave him as compassionate and empathetic as he is today. He postpones that train of thought, knowing only time would tell, and enjoys a quiet nightly walk with Elizabeth. Those plans are quickly shattered when he feels an immortal nearby and pulls out the Masamune. Elizabeth is shocked to see the very sword her brother was killed over in the hands of her lover. Macleod promises to explain later, as Toshiro shows himself, armed with 2 swords, one stuck in the stub Macleod had left. Toshiro draws blood first, which shocks Elizabeth to the core. He asks her to leave just as Toshiro knocks the sword out of his hand and prepares to behead him. Elizabeth quickly grabs the sword and thrusts it into his shoulder from behind. She pulls the sword out and prepares to behead him as revenge for Antonio's death, but Macleod stops her. Elizabeth doesn't understand why though, as Toshiro had killed her brother, and before she could make a decision, Toshiro stabs her to death. Holding her, Macleod sobs out an apology. Toshiro is unapologetic though, and tells Macleod that no mortals should interfere. Grabbing the sword, he begins the fight once more. Toshiro can't help himself as he brags about how the Masamune belongs to him and that Macleod did not know how to wield it. Macleod loses the sword once more, but he grabs Toshiro's hand and reminds him that he will never understand what it is to be a man like Ramirez or the great Masamune, and breaks his hand. He then maneuvers Toshiro's hand to behead himself, teaching him the lesson that any weapon can be used against the person who wields it. After giving Toshiro the end he deserved, Macleod laid Elizabeth to rest beside her brother. At her grave, he wonders whether there's a place in heaven for the immortals, and thanks Elizabeth for her company, which helped him continue along his path and take the next step. Though he was not aware how his quest would end, he knew he needed to keep going. It is definitely not easy being an immortal. I absolutely loved this miniseries, which held my attention to the very end. The art was pretty good too, though at some points I thought Macleod was more Harrison Ford than Christopher Lambert, but that could very well be an artistic choice. Have you read the comic yet? If you have not read it yet, go read it right now and tell me what you think about it in the comments below. If you liked the video, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, and turn on that bell notification. We will soon be back with more awesome stuff. Until then, goodbye.